So the record will be used for educational purpose. We have a new meeting of our cycle of Geopolitical Tuesdays. Today we will speak about a very interesting topic, at least for me, very interesting, but I think very actual as well. The geopolitics of Eastern Europe in the third decade, which means this decade of the 21st century, with the question mark moving towards Central Europe. We will listen to Alina. You will help me with the pronunciation. Alina Baihuzhakava. No, not really good.
Almost. It's Baihuzhakava.
Baihuzhakava.
Yes.
Yes. My name is Nikola Maslovsky, and I am one of the three organizers and the moderator of our cycle of Geopolitical Tuesdays. I'm representing the Faculty of Political Sciences and International Relations. We are organizing this cycle in collaboration with the French Center for Cultural Studies. Here, I would like to begin by thanking a lot the Ambassador of Lukashenko for the contact with Alina Baihuzhakava. I'm sorry again for the pronunciation. And maybe without any longer introduction, I will shortly present you and let you speak, because probably this is more interesting for us. You are a PhD candidate in security studies at the University of Warsaw. I will not quote everything that you have achieved, even though you are still belonging to the younger part of the academic population. Your research focuses on peace-building operations and activities in conflict-affected states. You were studying at the University of Warsaw, in SGH, the University of Economics in Warsaw, University of Zurich of Applied Science, and you were as well passing through a research program in India, at the University Manipal in India. And you were awarded the UNODA Scholarship for Peace and Security. Nowadays, parallelly to your PhD, you are working as a senior deployment assistant at Frontex. So we will see if this work in Frontex will be part of your analysis or not concerning Eastern Europe. Please complete what I have said. Thank you again for being with us. And after 40 minutes, maybe 50 minutes of your presentation, we will begin a seance, a part of question and answers. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Let me check if you can see my screen, because I usually have different technical problems. So can you see my presentation?
I can see it.
Yes.
Okay. Wait. Now I have to start presenting. No.
But maybe you could speak a little bit louder.
Wait, because I cannot. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes, thank you very much once again for inviting me. Today we'll be speaking about geopolitics of Eastern Europe in the 21st century, with a specific focus on Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, because currently these countries are in the spotlight of the events. And actually, during the recent years, I have been doing a lot of research on Belarus. So I would like to focus even more on this country, because during this research, I noticed that Belarus is the country that is usually not understood very well or stereotyped in international arena. And that's why I think it would be worthy to have some additional attention specifically on this country. So here is the structure of my presentation. I will start with geopolitical factors in Eastern Europe. Then I will go to the change of Russia's strategy in the 21st century. Then I will dedicate some time to the position of Belarus, specifically to the protests that took place in Belarus in 2020 following the elections. And then how this protest and the results of this protest affected current role of Belarus in the war in Ukraine. And then I will try to draw some conclusions and open questions for the discussion regarding how this situation can evolve in the coming years. So if we go to geopolitical factors in Eastern Europe, first of all, what should be mentioned is that the term of Eastern Europe is not really well defined, and there is a lot of different opinions of what constitutes Eastern Europe. Some people would say that former Soviet countries belong to Eastern Europe. Some would say that the whole Warsaw Pact countries, this is Eastern Europe, while, for example, in academia in Belarus or Ukraine, they would refer to these countries as the part of Central Eastern Europe. So this question is debatable. However, as I mentioned, I would like to focus today just on the three countries, so Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And of course, when we look at the map of Eastern Europe, it is clear that there is a huge disproportion in power, because there is one state which is dominating in terms of economic, military, demographic power in the region. And this has been so for centuries. What is also important is the position that Russia has in the energy sphere, because it is the world's leader in natural resources reserves. Specifically, it has world's largest natural gas reserves and 6th largest oil reserves. And of course, all of these reserves are not used in Russia, but they are exported for now mainly to Europe, because the huge demand of natural resources, of energy resources is in Europe. And this is where Belarus and Ukraine become important partners, because oil and gas transmissions pipeline go through these countries. Of course, recently, Russia has been trying to diversify its trading partners and build infrastructure in the Far East to facilitate delivery of energy resources to China, another country in huge demand of energy resources because of its economic development. However, still Europe remains the main partner in terms of energy trade. What is also important for this region is Soviet heritage, which can be understood in different terms. First of all, Belarus and Ukraine during Soviet times had separate vote in the General Assembly because they were founding members of the UN. And these countries also were the biggest military and economic power after Russia. And as you also know, nuclear weapons were also situated on their territories. So these countries were considered as the strongest and closest allies of Russia. From the other side, there is also a big cultural ethnic proximity of these countries, as well as language. This is also the reason why currently Ukraine tries to use only Ukrainian language to show the difference from Russia and somehow to distance themselves. Even though it's not that easy, because in many regions of Ukraine, Russian language is widely spoken, and actually in this region, Ukrainian was never used. So for these people, of course, it is a challenge to switch to Ukrainian language. And from the other side also, usually it's not Ukrainian language that is used, but Surjik, which is a mix of Ukrainian and Russian. So currently, this is a bit challenging. However, you know, it shows them, it highlights this proximity, and at the same time, the distancing that Ukraine is making from Russia and from Belarus. From the other side, during the last decades, soft power gained more importance in international relations. And if we look at Russia, actually soft power has been a weak point of this country, because it did not manage to attract from a political and economic perspective its neighbors. So we, when we look at Russia's modern history, we can see a clear change that was made at the very beginning of the 21st century, when Putin came into power. I assume all of you know his famous sentence when he said in 2005 that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And actually all the further actions and country strategy was aimed to regain this influence that Soviet Union had, and also to bring back the countries, the post-Soviet countries, to the sphere of influence. And if at the beginning, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the relations with former Soviet Republic were maintained in the way of, you know, brotherhood spirit, when Putin came into power, actually more pragmatism has been shown in these relations. This, of course, is related to the economic sphere, when for certain economic concessions, Russia expected former Soviet republics to closer integrate with them, or to show a clear support for Russia. And this was specifically visible in the energy sphere. For example, when just at the beginning of the 21st century, Belarus could buy oil and gas at domestic Russian prices. However, with later years, it was expected from Belarus to concede and to to closer integrate in political and military terms, and only then the prices could be lifted. Of course, the prices all the time went up, which was less beneficial for Belarusian economy. And these energy bargains, they took place in both directions. So from one side, Russia could use the power of price for energy resources. From the other side, the transit countries like Belarus and Ukraine, they could use their bargaining power in terms of transit fees. That's why for Russia, it became also a top priority to gain independence of energy transit routes that going through these countries. And actually, in case of Belarus, they succeeded, not immediately. However, over the years, Russia could obtain all the transition infrastructure in Belarus, which currently belongs to Russia's Gazprom. At the same time, Russia at certain moment showed that it is going to use war as a last resort if the countries that it considers their sphere of influence are going to lean towards the West. It happened in case of Georgia and in case of Ukraine. So from one side, this is a way to show how far Russia can go to regain its influence in the former Soviet republics. But from the other side, it's also a sign of weakness, which shows that no other means were effective to attract these countries in a natural way, or thanks to the economic benefits. So now I will speak about Belarus, and something that, in my opinion, is really making Belarus unique and maybe less understood also in the international arena, is strong aversion towards war, violence, or confrontation that is in Belarusian mentality. And this can be explained by different historical events. Namely, Belarus has never fought any aggressive wars. It was actually occupied many times by different sides. And of course, during these wars, Belarus suffered, and particularly during the Second World War, when 80% of the whole infrastructure of economy was devastated, and between 1/3 and 1/4 of the total population was killed during this war. So these events, they had a huge footprint on Belarusian mentality and also on their way to show their political activism. And for example, when the first occupation of Ukrainian territories took place in 2014, Belarusian reaction was very interesting in a way, because the next year, in 2015, there were supposed to be presidential elections, and these were the first elections after 1994 where no protests took place. And from a technical perspective, nothing changed because all the elections after 1994 were falsified. And it was clear that Lukashenko is not winning these elections. However, in 2015, people were extremely reluctant to protest. There was a political lethargy, and there was like a social decision to accept a bad peace rather than war. So actually the example of uprising in Ukraine and further occupation made a very negative effect on Belarusian perception of how they should participate in political life. And I'm saying acceptance of a bad peace because actually at that time economic situation in Belarus was quite bad. And still even bad economic situation did not influence, did not encourage any protests there. And several social surveys were done. And they actually confirm that the vast majority of Belarusians aspire for neutrality. So when there is a question if Belarus should align with Russia, or if it should join European Union, or if it should stay as independent state outside of any alliances and having friendly relations with all, this is the absolutely dominating idea for which 70% of the population vote. However, during these 5 years, between 2015 and 2020, Belarusian society mobilized, and after falsified again elections in 2020, there was an unprecedented massive demonstrations all over Belarus. They were unprecedented, first of all, in their size and their coverage, because usually the protests took place just in the capital, Minsk, or in some regional cities. However, at that time, they took places in cities, in towns, in regions, in villages, everywhere. And they were supported also by different layers of the society, including regime proponents. So during these protests, even traditionally pro-regime layers, and here I mean, for example, older population that has the tendency of sentiment towards Soviet times, for example, or even state-owned media, even people in the president's administration, in diplomatic corpus, resigned during this protest and showed their support to the protesters. And also these protests should not be understood in the same way as previous protests in Ukraine, because first of all, these protests were not about a European Union or about Russia, about showing support to either of these. These protests were only about Belarus and about disapproval for the current regime. So also when social surveys were made, it appeared that 98% of demonstrators joined the protest because of violence and political repressions that took place during the presidential campaign or during the day of elections. because such a scale of violence also never took place. It was not only kidnappings, brutal arrests, tortures, but also people were killed, which actually never happened before. And they were killed during the protest, but also they were, for example, beaten to death in prisons. And this scale of violence from the regime triggered this additional support from different layers of the society, and the support for protests were huge. Also, the second motivation was to protest against Lukashenko, against his regime, and third, of course, against elections falsification. As I already mentioned, these protests were, they received quite a violent response from the government, and also the violence was not only directed towards protesters. There was like a complete lawlessness, because even a random person passing by could be arrested without any reasons for that, and then of course brutally beaten and tortured. And the expectation from the government was that this response would prevent people from further joining the protest, or from the other side, maybe it would trigger some violent response from protester side, so that later it can be shown in the media that actually protests were violent, and that's why there was a need to brutally fight with the protesters. However, it was not the case. And unlike in Ukraine, these protests continued to be peaceful, and there were no paramilitary groups created to fight the police or special forces. In my opinion, this was the year actually when we could see the maximum level of mobilization of Belarusian potential. So such a protest movement was never seen before, but also it's hard to foresee something like this in the future. And factors of this mobilization can be found in the following. So first of all, because these protests were peaceful, it is clear that if protest would turn violent at certain point, actually many of the supporters would not join this anymore. From the other side, there was a momentum which made the situation really likely to change in terms of government change, because factories started to strike, and many employees left their jobs voluntarily. So at certain point, the country could not anymore function economically, and even in state media, for 2 weeks, there were no journalists, and state media were showing the same programs all the time. From the other side, there was a female participation, which is also, when I was following these events, I noticed that in the main global media, like CNN, Washington Post, this female participation in Belarus was perceived from Western lens of feminism, when in reality it was more a pragmatic choice, I would say, because during the first days of the protests, due to cultural factors, mostly men were arrested and brutally treated. So for women, it became kind of incentive to participate, because they could feel that they would not be affected by this brutality. That's why there was a massive participation of female population in the process. However, this did not lead to any significant results, because there was no strong support of international community. And from the other side, Russia strongly supported Lukashenko's regime with additional financial support, which allowed to better pay the uniformed forces that received, additional incentive to fight this movement. And then protest movement was actually channeled to a peaceful activism, some partisan movements and activities, trying to have a national dialogue, which didn't take place. And the opposition went either to prisons or abroad and started their activity there. However, this momentum was already lost, so there was no change. Thanks to this deal and concessions that Lukashenko received at that time from Russia, we can suspect that there was kind of a deal, because for Lukashenko it was a paramount to stay in power at any costs. Russia provided this support, which allowed him to stay in power. And the price for that was, of course, current support of Belarus in the war in Ukraine, where Belarus allowed to use its territory. However, we can see that this current policy of Belarus is turning completely from the image that it wanted to create during the last 2 decades, when Belarus on international arena trying to prove its multi-vector foreign policy, friendly relations. It was also trying to diversify its energy strategy a bit. So currently it's clear, and actually in 2020 it became already clear that because of this internal situation, currently Belarus is absolutely isolated. That's why the only way for it was to have a closer integration with Russia. So I would say that there was no really a choice for Belarus not to support Russia in what is happening in Ukraine. However, many people ask this question whether Belarusian population would participate, for example, if there would be a mobilization in Belarus. And I think this is not an easy question to answer, because from one side, we should understand that Belarusian population was never supporting any kind of war, first of all. But secondly, it was also trying to its maximum to fight against its own regime, and it did not achieve anything. So that's why it would be really hard to fight against any new policy introduced. However, I would say that what can be expected is again some kind of partisan movements that would try to avoid in different ways the participations, but for sure not a very, very clear stance in the form of protest. This is something that for sure we cannot expect. So here I would like to stop and thank you very much. I can imagine that you might have some questions or comments. So I would like to hear this.
Thank you very much for this, as I said earlier, very actual topic. And as I understand, you know particularly well Belarus, yes, from personal reasons as well?
Belarusian, not Belarusian. Yes, and thank you for your lecture.
It was, one second. Yes, I was speaking to our guest. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Everything is okay. And I understand that someone began to speak. It means that you have probably already, there is maybe a queue for questions, or Mr.
I just see one hand raised.
There is one question that is in the chat and one question with a raised hand. So maybe we'll begin with a raised hand, Mr. Murashka.
Yes. Yeah, I wanted to comment and ask, it was really strange to hear that like women participated because of practical reasons in protest, because they wasn't beaten. It was strange to hear it because a lot of women was beaten severe during the protest, even a few days, and everyone knew it. And I would say that main reason why women participated because of their, I don't know, kindness, and they were so shocked and upset that it is impossible to treat people, and that is why women participated so I don't know, widely in this process. Not because it was safe for women, because it wasn't safe from the very beginning. Women were being arrested. Of course, when was women marches, it was for some extent not so like brutal, but from the very beginning, women were suffering during this process. And I wouldn't say that it was like just practical decision to participate just because I would be safe like a woman during the process. It was, for me, it was quite strange to hear, and because it will, I don't know, downgrade the level of insecurity and the level of empathy from women from Belarus, because they were risking their lives, they're healthy, just to show that they did not accept this way of treating people from Belarus government.
Yes. I agree that I don't say that they were not totally secure, for sure not. But if you compare the level, and especially at the very beginning of protest, if you compare the level of violence against men and women, you could easily notice that mainly the violence was aimed at men, and they were more brutally beaten and tortured and killed. Of course, at later stages of protests, there was even more violence towards women because additional police women were participating in the protest, and there were some really brutal cases when police women were beating even very old women. So I do not want to downgrade the security, the feeling of security, and say that women were not risking at all. However, in my opinion, for sure, at the beginning of the protests, it could be very noticeable that violence was mainly directed to men. I'm not saying that no single woman was arrested in the first day. However, when you see the proportions, it's very clear picture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I made a mistake. There is no question in the chat. It was just a question to me and not a question to you. Just, is there any other question? Other way, I would have some questions, but first, let's give the floor to the possibility to the people online to ask, because I will have a lot of questions too. I understood that from your presentation that you were concentrating a lot on Belarus, but you were beginning your presentation by speaking, and in the title of your seminar, you were speaking about a switch from Eastern Europe towards Central Europe. And I have a naive question, because since already more than 20 years, we hear that Russia is leaving Eastern Europe to go in the direction of Eurasia. And now I hear that the rest of Eastern Europe is going in the direction of Central Europe. So what is so bad is being in Eastern Europe if everybody wants to leave the name, even the name of being part of Eastern Europe? And second part of the same question, there are strong tensions, it's very clear now, between Ukraine and Russia. Yeah, there is even a war, an invasion, and inside of the Belarusian society. And there were protests. But there are as well a lot of common elements between Russia and, for example, Belarus. For example, the language, but as well, there is the interest of the political hierarchy in Belarus are somehow very related with Russia, but you have as well family relations and so on. So can we really speak about a split, or just some element of tensions? Can we go more precisely in the definition of the differences of trajectories that could emerge? Nowadays, we don't see these different trajectories, but I understood that you are believing that they will emerge. Yes, that the Belarusian society maybe is going more in the direction of Central Europe. And what will stay common with Russia and the Russian nation? I don't know if I was clear in my questions.
You will see by the answers. Let's start with the last question. You know, I would say that actually Ukrainian language and Belarusian language are to the same extent similar or different to Russian language. It's not like Ukrainian language is more similar, is more different from Russian and Belarusian is more similar. Absolutely not. I would say, you know, this distance is exactly the same. And the same also about the culture, because Belarusian culture, Ukrainian culture, it has a lot of unique and different features. However, still a lot of elements, they stay common. However, during the current situation, this is something that would be difficult to reconcile and bring back to the same good relations, even on the society's level. Because of course, currently, even what we can see with the Ukrainian language, when more and more Ukrainian no longer want to use Russian language, and even if it is challenging for them to switch to purely Ukrainian language, they are still choosing to do this. This is just one of the signs of this distancing from everything what is Russian. So going closer to the to Central Europe, to Western direction. And I mean, even if we speak about success of eventual success of Russia in this war, still it's very hard to imagine Ukrainian people supporting Russian occupation or the newly established government that would be pro-Russian. So for sure, this step of invading Ukraine was a big mistake in terms of this idea of being, building a commonwealth of countries. So for sure, in soft power, Russia tremendously failed. When we speak about Belarus, also currently it's clear that the war is not supported. So, you know, there is this also distancing from Russia's political regime. However, I would not say that it is this aversion is so strong on people's level. So even though you know, both in Ukraine and in Russia there are different family ties. I mean, in Belarus, in Ukraine, Russia, still, because Ukraine was affected quite severely by the conflict, this distancing is also on the societal, on people's level. While in Belarus, it's not a case to such an extent. However, for sure, there is a strong disapproval on people's level for the regime, both in Belarus and in Russia. And for your first question, from what I understood, you asked what is the risk of leaving Eastern Europe, right? No.
No, that was not really a question of risk, but you say that Eastern Europe was not precisely defined.
Yeah.
But I hear since years that Russia is saying that they are not anymore in Eastern Europe, they are in Eurasia. There's a new geopolitical vision. And there was years ago, I remember when in Poland, people didn't want to belong to Eastern Europe and were supporting this idea of belonging to Central Europe or to Central East.
Yes,
Europe, Central East. And now I have the feeling that this is the same a little bit for part of the Ukrainian Belarusian.
Yes,
so for me, it's where will be Eastern Europe if everybody will leave?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, because indeed countries in this region don't want to be perceived as Eastern Europe because just this naming, Eastern Europe, was stereotyped, you know, during the whole recent history as something, as referring to, you know, very poor region, dependent region. So when you say Eastern Europe, it seems that these states are not independent, they are not developed, so nobody wants to be associated with something like this. That's why from the other side, when highlighting central part, it means something important. So you're in the center, on the crossroads, meaning you are important. And actually this is a very interesting fact, because almost in every country in this region, there is an official point, a geographical point, which is referred as the geographical center of Europe. And this point can be found in Lithuania, in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Poland, in Slovakia, in Czech Republic. And of course, it depends how you measure geographically. So, I mean, for sure, it has some factual base. It's just a different ways of measuring. However, yes, it shows that for each of the countries, it's really important to be in the center. And, you know, it makes this country more attractive geopolitically to raise its position. But also, I would say, even image perspective, even simple way as, you know, attracting tourists. You can brand your country as the very, very center of Europe.
Thank you. Any other questions? Maybe I would have still, first I wanted to thanks for, I orally earlier and now on the chat I received a correction that we have to speak about Belarus and Belarusian and not Belarusian. So I think that symbols are important, thank you. But I believe that this belongs exactly to this process of differentiation that is seen as an important element of for emancipation. I have another question. You were in the title, we were expecting geopolitics, but actually you are speaking a lot about internal politics. But you are right, because you were convincing us that internal politics in Belarus, in Belarus. In Belarus, and not only, are related with geopolitical relations. And now my naive question again is, what are the possibilities for Lukashenko to find a place to keep the power, yes, without maybe thanks to the help of Russia, without being annexed, without any annexion from Russia over its territory, because it would on the Belarus territory, because it would bring to a loss of his power probably as well. So do you think, so the question is naive, yes, but we don't see if he has a lot of possibilities to act, and is it possible to find a maneuver between these two kind of forces that are representing for him personally a danger?
So, I mean, in the recent years, it has been used massively in the official narrative that Lukashenko is balancing all the time between East and West, and that he is actually trying to protect the independence of Belarus in this way. However, in reality, he is really trying to protect his power, because without support of Russia, he would not be able to stay in power. But also sometimes he had to lean towards the West or show some interest in European in cooperation with Europe, to put some additional bargaining power on the table with Russia. However, with what you started about internal factors, to which I dedicated a lot of time, This is actually because I wanted to make it clear that Belarusians are quite aware of their geopolitical position. And they are aware that there is a really strong neighbor, Russia, and from the other side there is European Union, so integrated Europe, also strong economically, and you know, in this social service that we could see in Belarus, it shows that Belarus really wants to be in between and don't want to be involved in anything, doesn't want to be seen as part of something separate, but just to live peacefully with everyone. However, this is something really difficult practically, and we will see how the situation is developing. And whether Belarus will be annexed, this is also a good question, because theoretically, of course, it's possible, but from the other side, what is the need for this if there is already a political support from Lukashenko?
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions. I don't see any raised hand, maybe, but I wanted here to remind us that since the protests after the election, we have still many political prisoners in Belarus. Some of them are very young, and their life will be transformed by this experience. So it's a very important topic. It's not just a theoretical topic of great powers game, but it touches as well individuals and sometimes very courageous young or older individuals. Some of them had to escape to come to Poland or to Lithuania or other countries. So I think it's an important moment to remind this kind of situation.
And actually,
I
these
think
repressions, they still continue. So it's already 3 years after, but they still continue, and there are even more ways, legal ways, to bring these people to prisons. Because recently laws were amended, and all the opposition media, for example, they were put as extremist groups. So currently, anyone who is just putting a like on social media of this, opposition media, or shares a post, shares a picture from them, can be treated as supporting extremist groups. So it is a serious case.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm having a last look at, we still have time, yes? Am I wrong? Yes, we still have time. So, any other questions? Our public seems to be shy today. So maybe, I don't know if it's your topic, but can I ask you about still naive questions, but do you know something about, I'm reading in different newspapers that part of the population is not so interested in participating in this war in Ukraine side by side with Russia, but and even that there were some terrorist attacks within Russia concerning concerning some operation as actually to prevent Belarus to support here politically and militarily the Russian intervention. Do you know more about that? How strong is this support, and how strong is or will be the involvement of Belarus side by side with Russia?
With Russia? Because currently there is also a Belarusian battalion which is fighting in Ukraine with Ukrainians. And yes, indeed, there are some partisan actions against Russian military presence in Belarus and against their action directed to Ukraine. However, for Belarusians to be fully against, let's say, I mean, in the case of mobilization, for example, for Belarusians to be to fully take the Ukrainian side, there should also be a good alternative, yes, because currently this first of all, opposition and in general these groups, they are, how to say, they of course have to be very cautious in their actions. So maybe Belarusians don't see it as a very strong movement, as a very strong opposition. And that's why they may be actually hesitant to join. So, you know, in this situation, it's really hard to predict because it depends on the actions of both sides. Because also the opposition should show their strengths so that people want to join them more clearly and support Ukraine.
Thank you. Once again, any other questions? I still have some questions in reserve, but I don't want to monopolize your whole attention. So are you sure there is no other questions? Last week, so I go on and continue with my questions. Last week, I was reading in newspapers that there was an agreement from the Belarus government to host tactical nuclear weapons from Russia on its territory. This provoked a lot of emotions. There were some articles saying that it will never happen without the acceptance of the Chinese government. Or do you have the feeling that it will change the geopolitics of the region?
How to say? I think currently it's anyways clear that Belarusian government is on the side of Russia. So putting additional weaponry on Belarus does not really change much the situation because the government is with Russia anyways. Still, the question of Belarusian participation in the conflict is not so clear because Lukashenko also understands the sentiments in Belarusian society. He also understands the orientation of Belarusian society. So I would tend to think that he would like to delay as much as possible any active engagement, any more active engagement of Belarus in the conflict. However, he has to support any kind of passive support to Russia because of agreements and because Russia is actually helping him to stay in power. So this is something he cannot really avoid.
Okay, thank you. I open again the possibility to have a question. So on my side, I would have one last question if nobody else is asking. After I will stop with my questions. It is still a naive question. Once again, some people consider that part of the activity of Putin, part of his work, is to rebuild the Soviet Union or to address to a kind of still existing a little bit Soviet nation, that some people still feel belonging to this kind of world. So, do you have the feeling that in Belarus, the Soviet world is still existing, the Soviet nation is convincing to part of the population, or it is just a kind of imaginated element, part of a kind of larger propaganda?
Well, I would say that, as I already mentioned, the older population, some percentage for sure has this sentiment towards Soviet times. However, recently it is less and less associated with the current situation because even what we saw during the protests, it became apparent that, you know, even these layers of the society, they were against the government. Of course, we cannot say that 100% of population was against. However, still, it's becoming more and more minority simply because people are not happy with the current policies. And actually, at the beginning, Lukashenko always wanted to build this sentiment of Soviet times. And he was always saying that he is a Soviet person and that he is building a socialist state in Belarus. And now, when after 20, almost 30 years, people see no results, no benefits for them of this so-called social state, which is not actually social in reality. These sentiments are becoming less significant. And yeah, so this narrative on the Belarusian side is not really effective from the Belarusian government. However, in Russia, it can be a different story because support for the government in Russia is totally different than it is in Belarus. As we could see, the protests in Russia, they were mostly concentrated in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and while other regions, they are vastly supporting the current regime. So this cannot be really compared. But for sure, in the Russian narrative, this is still existing, this idea of rebuilding former strengths to bring back former republics together. But it's not so easy anymore.
So thank you very much. Is there any questions? If not, so first I wanted to thank you a lot.
Thank you.
Alina Baihuzhakava, is that okay? No?
Yes, Baihuzhakava, yes. It's
okay.
A difficult surname anyways, no matter in which language you say it.
And sorry for my my mistakes in the name of Belarus, Belarusian. It's we are in the process of learning in a world changing regularly. But I believe that you brought to us a very interesting light to what is happening. Maybe not to Eastern Europe, but to the eastern part of the EU. And that is very, very important in the context of this war. Now, what is happening in that region has a world importance and may decide as well about what will happen in Asia and in the great power relations. So we are speaking about not only actual, but very, very important topics. Important from the great power politics and important from the point of view of the citizens fighting for democracy. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
And to the, I see you received other applauses. And to the other student, I invite you in 2 weeks for our next Geopolitical Tuesday. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.